Action. Action. Gabrielle, action.
Sorry, my internet is unstable. I'm fully stable. My internet is what's unstable. Okay, it's so good to see you beautiful people on your faces. Thank you for joining us this evening. We had intended to host this salon in our home before the plague, but things have changed, as we know. And it's like having a village that's not in the village. So I'm quite grateful, in fact, that we were able to extend the invitation all across the globe, and we have people here from all over the world. So welcome. If you have nothing to say, mute. But if you feel like you must speak up, then certainly unmute yourself for sure. Or there's also the message box that you can utilize. So some of you may remember Marc Gafni, Dr. Marc Gafni, from our wedding in Montana, our wild, raunchy wedding. And I knew the moment that I met Marc that I would pursue him to the ends of the earth to join Sharif and I in holy matrimony. And he has been skillfully guiding our love deeper and deeper ever since. Marc's unorthodox code by which he lives upholds the beliefs I have sought for many years. His profound understanding of self and of the unique instrument within the great orchestra of the entire cosmos speaks intimately to who I am and who I hope to become. And selfishly, I don't want to go on this journey alone. So I invite all of you, my dearest, most respected friends and family, to open your minds and hearts and allow the new renaissance to unfold. Sharif?
Thanks, Gabrielle. Welcome, everyone. I am really excited to be part of what is the kickoff of the Salon. What you are participating in is a strategy to change the world into a better place. How do we do that? What would that look like? Based upon what principles? Well, we aren't starting from scratch. Gabrielle and I are co-chairs of the Center for Integral Wisdom. It's a think tank with around 30 really brilliant people, masters of diverse disciplines, who have already produced volumes pinpointing existential risks and solutions that would not just save our world, but transform it into a sustainable one of peace and love. And the leader of our think tank is Dr. Gafni, who wears many hats, including Oxford scholar and philosopher, one of the world's leading political social theorists, author of 24 books, and he also happens to be the rabbi that married Gabrielle and me. Look, this is not some new dogma, new age dogma, that remains just that dogma. This is serious business with serious experts driven by serious integrity. We are facing existential threats, and I want to be part of the solution. So you might ask, why are you invited? Because we see something so uniquely brilliant in you that we want you to have a seat at the table. Who wouldn't have wanted a seat at the table with Leonardo da Vinci when the Renaissance was being birthed? Well, here is your chance. So without further ado, may I present Dr. Gafni.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharif. Thank you, Gabrielle. It is an absolute delight to be with you and to be, in the joy and in the trembling as we begin this journey. And this is an incredibly significant moment. And I could not be more honored and just delighted that Gabrielle and Sharif, that we're partnering together with Christina, Dr. Kincaid, together with the leadership of the Center for Integral Wisdom at this incredibly critical moment in history. Before Gabrielle and Sharif, the board chairs were Barbara Marx Hubbard, who is the leading futurist, about which Buckminster Fuller said, no one knows more about the future than Barbara. right before Barbara, John Mackey, a grocer who's also the founder and CEO of Whole Foods, was the previous board chair. And there's been an incredible lineage. And now as we're at this incredibly pivotal moment, right, Gabrielle and Sharif, to have you stepping in is so important, so vital. And we really came to Miami at your invitation to really locate the center here in Miami, and what that means, what the implications of that, this international center, right, emerging from Miami is part of what we'll talk about tonight. But let's start in the middle and let's go all the way in. So welcome everyone. We're at this moment where we're literally poised between utopia and dystopia. There are literally two futures before us. And it literally is true that we live in the best of times with unimaginable possibility, and we live in the worst of times with unimaginable destruction possible. And the level of destruction that we're talking about, just like the level of possibility, is beyond anything that human history has ever known. And I want to try and kind of find and access that with you. It's what we call catastrophic and existential risk. And our ability to actually imagine and know what that means is our ability to respond to it and navigate it successfully. If we can't imagine it, then we can't actually engage, we can't respond. You know, the original word in the original Hebrew for both man and woman is Adam. And Adam means grounded, human, you know, humus, right? The soil, the ground. But Adam also means adameh in the original text in the Semitic language, which means imagination. So the human being is homo imaginus. We're not just homo sapien, we're homo imaginus. And homo imaginus has to imagine possibility. And because we're facing possibilities that are literally unprecedented, both for the good and for the horror, we actually have to be able to imagine them. And this week, we're just going to set the context of the conversation. We're going to start with existential risk and catastrophic risk. And what does that mean? And I'm going to watch my time here carefully. We're going to finish within the hour. And we're going to cover an enormous amount of ground. So hold on to your seats. Let's take a ride. But let's take a ride not for entertainment, right? We're not doing wisdom and entertainment. We're not doing wisdotainment. We're actually taking a ride in order to take our place at the seat of history, to actually move from being spectators to being on the court. And most of our lives, we're so in the myopia of our daily lives and our daily commitments and the good things of our children and our families and perhaps our pet project and some important philanthropies and our communal and that's all good and it's all critical, but none of it is going to actually take us where we need to get today. We need to actually imagine an unprecedented reality. And if we don't, we will face in a very short order of time, literally not just catastrophic, but existential risk. And I want to just distinguish between them for a second. By catastrophic, we mean pandemic, right? COVID-19, but exponentialized, right? COVID-19 has been relatively mild. But what it's reminded us is that actually it's not too big to fail. And we've been looking at the Center for Integral Wisdom with enormous commitment and passion, an incredible group of several dozen people, thinkers, leading edge of their fields from around the world. But we've come together not to think abstractly. Right? It's not a think tank, although we call it a think tank. It's an activist tank, right? It's an action tank, right? It's how can we actually conceptualize, understand, feel into where we are at this moment in reality in order to be able to avoid the unbearable suffering, right, that is almost inevitable if we don't take dramatic steps, and to realize the enormous possibility, right, that also is unlike anything we could ever imagine. So let's just define terms for a second. Okay, we're ready to go? Here we go. So catastrophic risk, pandemic, but exponentialized, right? Great tragedy to enormous amounts of the human population. So the Black Death, for example, was catastrophic risk. It destroyed in the Middle Ages a quarter to half of Europe. Existential risk is of an entirely different order. Existential risk means threat, right, to the very existence of humanity, right? And potentially to all life. The earth will remain, but an essential threat to the future itself. Existential risk means there won't be a future. Now, Derek Parfet. How many people have heard of Derek Parfet? Derek Parfet was a philosopher at Oxford. And in general, just to kind of general over our conversations, if I mention a philosopher and you've never heard of them, just lie and say that you have, because it just makes everyone feel better, okay? So Derek Parfet, super important philosopher, and he asks the following question. He gives 3 scenarios. Scenario 1, everything's great, everything's fine, we're all happy, okay? That's easy. Scenario 2, we're hit with catastrophic risk of an incredible magnitude, okay? And we lose 7 point something billion, right, of the Earth's population, meaning the overwhelming majority of people alive. Scenario 3, whoever's left, the last million or 5 million, right, that last group, we lose that last group. So he asks, which is worse, right, scenario 2, right, or scenario 3? And virtually everyone responds, as you can imagine. Obviously, scenario 2 is worse. You're losing 7.5 billion people. And scenario 3 is obviously tragic, but you're losing exponentially smaller numbers, exponentially smaller deaths, smaller suffering. So obviously, scenario 2, right, is the worst. But as you can already begin to intuit, it's not that clear. And Parfet argues, and I stand with Parfet, that actually in some profound sense, 3 is far worse. Why is 3 worse? 3 is worse because in scenario 3, it's not just a question of that group of people who die. What actually dies with that last group of people is the entire future. We actually lost all future generations. We lost, right, there are, according to our best scientific estimates, we have in this run of reality, given any number of variables, which I'm not going to go into now, let's say another 1 trillion years. Another 1 trillion years, how many children are born? How many babies grow up? How much incredible, gorgeous goodness, truth, and beauty that is manifest in reality, right? How much wonder beyond imagination, how much depth, how much transformation, all of that. And exponential numbers of human beings, billions and billions and billions and billions, it's all lost. Now, that's what I mean. You have to be, right? You have to extend your reach. You have to get uncomfortable in order to imagine into this. It's virtually, you can't imagine it, right? That actually we could be at a moment in which there's a fundamental threat to the future itself, right? We can't even imagine that could be true. And just so you get a sense of it, right, here's just an example, one book by, I happen to have it right here, by Toby Ord, right, called The Precipice, right? See, we got a book club going on here, right? The Precipice by Toby Ord, right? Toby basically says that, you know, in the next block of time, it's 1 in 6 that we don't make it. Now, I just want, if you kind of felt good at that number, imagine you're about to cross a bridge, right? And the bridge says 1 in 6, it's going to fall. Will you cross the bridge? Of course you won't. Would you let your children cross the bridge? No. Will you let anyone you love cross the bridge? Obviously not. Right? So when we say 1 in 6 in the next relatively short period of time, that's not good news. 1 in 6. But in the longer period of time, wow, Toby Ord says it's 1 in 2. So get a sense of that. And Ord is not a kind of let's see if I can get that word, prognosticate. He's not doing casual prognostication. He's doing hard math, right, at Oxford. He's connected to the Oxford Center for Existential Risk, where Nick Bostrone and a whole group of other people have done incredibly important work. Lots of these people are students of Derek Parfet, who I mentioned. And when he does the hard math, the hard, careful statistical analysis, he gets 1 in 6 for the short period and 1 in 2 for the long period. So anyone, right, who can actually imagine into that, how can we not look at that? And most people literally, right, no one's taken their seat at the table of history. You would think that there's a government someplace handling this, right? You would think that there's some set of agencies that have got this covered. They don't. They don't, because it's virtually unimaginable. And it's only actually in the last year that even the word in the last, not the last year, since the beginning of the pandemic, which is what, March 2020, that actually the very notion of existential risk has made it beyond a very small group of us. Because what the pandemic showed us was that it's not too big to fail. Does everyone get that? Everyone realized all of a sudden it can stop, right? That seemed unimaginable, right? The assumption was it's too big to fail. We now know that's not true, that actually this pandemic has demonstrated clearly, and the pandemic isn't even catastrophic risk, but the pandemic, you can view the pandemic as dress rehearsal for genuine catastrophic risk and dress rehearsal for existential risk. Now, to talk about existential risk, one of the reasons that people don't talk about it is A, they can't imagine it. Governments can't wrap their heads around it. But B, in order to understand it, you need a very cross-disciplinary, across many platforms, understanding of reality. And the entire world of the academy today suffers from what the French call deformation professionnelle, right? That is to say, people are completely tracked in. I'm an anthropologist, and not only am I an anthropologist, but I deal with anthropology between the year 1920 and 1950, and that's what I write about, and don't ask me about anything else. And if I broaden my horizon, well, I'm a really broad thinker, I'm going to add 1950 to 1970 to my thinking about anthropology. Or I deal with chemistry in a particular form of chemistry and a particular field of chemistry. I'm in a particular dimension of molecular biology. I'm studying the first phase of meiosis. That's what I do. Do you understand? And it's people are actually bracketed in a tragic way in a myopic view of reality that doesn't actually feel across disciplines. But you can only think about existential risk if you actually understand economics and currency, right, and pathogens, right, and structures of environment and infrastructures and complicated versus complex systems, right, and an enormous amount about the 4 or 5 major schools of psychology that split into another 6, right? And then you need to know something really important about politics and human nature and interiors, and right, there's an enormous amount you need to know to even begin to think about it, and you need to actually know it across platforms. So the academy can't even begin to think about it, and obviously, right, the same people who are in the key positions in government are trained in the same academy and focused very narrowly. So we've got to widen, we've got to broaden, we got to think wider. We got to begin to be able to grasp the big picture. Now, you might think, why me? There's other people who got this handled, right? This certainly can't be me. So here's the thing, that's not quite true. Right? The reason we focused the Center for Integral Wisdom on existential risk, because we came to the shocking realization that by and large, there are no adults in the room. Right? That actually it's barely being addressed, that it's being addressed at a level of superficiality that's beyond, to say it's shocking is the understatement of all understatements, right? There's virtually no resources. There's virtually no resources in any government, right, addressed to it. And we're talking about, just to be clear, the death of humanity, or existential risk, the collapse of humanity, right, to a level of breakdown that human flourishing effectively ends. Okay, think Mad Max exponentialized. Okay, if you want to get a sense of that. Okay, so wow, right? I'll give you another word for it. We might call that, and we sometimes relate to it as the first and second shock of existence. What's the first shock of existence? When the dawn man or dawn human, the original man, the original woman, have an experience of death, right? Death obviously exists in the animal world. Death exists in the early human world. Humans in some form are around for a couple of million years, and humans related to Homo sapien are around for a couple 100,000 years. Obviously, people die, but there's not an existential experience of death. No one's drawing paintings in cave walls around death. No one's writing poems about death. No one's fearing death. No one's thinking about death. Wow, I see a bison heading at me. Oops, I died, right? But I'm not spending 6 weeks thinking about the bison, right? So the existential, the actual fear of death, right? The skull grinning at the banquet, that's what we might call the first shock of existence, the death of the individual human being. But the second shock of existence, and it's shocking beyond imagination. And to be Homo imaginus, we got to begin to be able to imagine it, right? The second shock of existence is not the death of the individual human being, it's the very death of humanity. And so we're confronted in this moment with the second shock of existence. And I want to just spend, a very short amount of time. And again, I'm gonna watch my clock carefully. You watch it carefully. Every second counts here. Okay. So on my clock, Eastern time, at 7:45, it's now 7:03. We're done. Okay. So every second we're together, and we're creating something which is shocking and beautiful, and utterly necessary and urgent, but it's ecstatically urgent. So my point here is not to induce fear, although an enormous level of radical concern and trepidation, right, which should translate into this fully awestruck awakeness. Fear paralyzes us. In the original Hebrew texts, the word for fear and awe is the same word. You can go in two ways. You can go to fear and get paralyzed and put your head back in the sand and disappear. Right? This is too much, right? I'm not sure why Gabriel and Sharif invited me. I love them dearly, can't handle this. Or I can say, you know what? I trust their judgment. There's a reason why I'm invited here. And I'm actually going to take my seat at this table. And the seat that we're taking at the table is we're actually going to try and understand existential risk. And in future salons, so we're going to be doing these salons once a month, we're going to begin to unpack what we think is the best response. And we're going to participate together in articulating the best and probably the only effective response to existential risk in a way, now hold on to your seat, that can literally affect the very future trajectory of reality. Now, you might think that's grandiose. It's not. It's not. It's hard-nosed, pragmatic, on the ground. So hold on to your seat. Right, let's take this ride. And to take the ride, let's just spend a couple of minutes, a few minutes, just getting a sense of what we mean, kind of trying to bring this home by existential risk. Now, we could spend, obviously, and we should spend 10 hours going through each existential risk. I'm not going to do that. But let me just touch for a few minutes so we can just get the fragrance of it, okay? If you want to get the fragrance of number one, carbon emissions and global warming, climate change, which is the one that's most famous, I'm going to spend the least time on, take a look at David Attenborough's new documentary. What's it called? Life on This Planet, I think, right, Gabrielle? I think it's Life on This Planet, right? Attenborough's done a good job to actually portray, and his conclusion is that if things continue as they are without a dramatic revisioning and reconfiguring of the way we act on the planet, then there will be what he calls a systems collapse, which will end civilization as we know it. I just want you to get, we're talking about a mainstream Brit, right, who majors in understatement. If you watch the documentary, it's actually well done. It's very beautifully done, but he majors in understatement every sentence. The dude doesn't have, right, a drop of hyperbole in him. It's not what he's about. And yet the only conclusion that he can reasonably come to is that climate change will lead within X amount of time to civilizational collapse. Now, there's an argument about the time frame. There are some who argue that we kind of moved from, what I might call pandemic shock in the 2020s to climate change shock in the 2030s. So in the pandemic shock, our basic systems are in place. We lose our jobs for a while, then we get them back again, right? Our business burns down, so we're insured. We can kind of cover it. When climate shock happens, then fires are raging out of control exponentially to what's happening today. Flooding is happening. Insurance, my actuaries can't even calculate it. No one's going to give you credit. Insurance disappears. Climate shock goes on. You do everything you can to survive. And then you go into the 2040s and you head into what we might call extinction shock. Extinction shock, when actually a lake disappears, right? A forest, right, is gone. And the very ecosystem itself collapses. That's one scenario. Another scenario painted by Attenborough gives a somewhat more extended timeline. But when I say somewhat more extended, 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, that's the negotiation. So we're talking about, something of unimaginable consequence. Okay. So that's one field, right? This movement from pandemic shock to climate change shock to, right, extinction shock. It would be the sixth mass extinction. And after extinction shock, it's not that everyone's dead, although a lot of people are. It's that we're now in what I called earlier an exponentialized Mad Max world where there's virtually no resource. Everything is about power, radical authoritarianism, and ultimately it implodes on itself, right? Right? And if there's any survivors, right, it's this very, very elite few, and everyone else is gone. Okay, so let's stay with this. That's climate shock, right? That's 2, nuclear weapons. Strangely enough, the threat of an accidental deployment of a nuclear weapon remains on hair trigger, and people barely know the threat exists. The amount of close calls we've had is shocking. There's an entire conversation, right, which is happening in very, very narrow corridors. The public's unaware of an immense nuclear threat. Add to that rogue deployment of nuclear drones or other forms of equally powerful drones. Those drones used to be available to a very, very small population who were all state actors. Now there's a much larger, more diffuse people with access to that technology, right? Let's say it used to be 500, now it's 5,000. That's an enormous, right, expansion. And a decent amount of them are non-state actors. That's a huge deal. Okay, let's keep going, right? The essential structure of fractional reserve banking, right, is set on a direction of collapse, right? Our essential extraction model, where we're extracting from the earth resources that it took the earth billions of years to develop. The extraction model, right, which drives, right, we have to extract in order to consume, which covers over our sense of vacuity and emptiness, which drives what we might call an exponential growth curve. There's an exponential growth curve both in population, right, and in production and in consumption. The growth is for its own sake, right, distributed with complete lack of equity or equality. And exponential growth curves always fall off a cliff. That's their nature, right, if you understand how growth curves work. And of course, the lack of equity means that there's this chasm, right, between haves and have-nots. But this chasm between have and have-nots is not governed by a medieval structure where people have no access to real information about how the haves live, or they can't actually breach the castle wall. We now live in a world in which, again, right, enormous technology is available, right, to a much wider range of people who have the ability, right, to wreak damage, catastrophic, and even existential destruction because I'm from the have-nots, right, and the haves are ignoring me, right? So we're creating the structure of, besides the violation of humanity, right? I'm not talking about, we're not talking here, this is not an ethical conversation. That's a given. We're talking about existential and catastrophic risk, right? This huge yawning chasm, right? Growing exponentially. We're actually reintroducing an international caste system, which makes the Indian caste system look like, you know, democracy on a good day in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. That's what's happening all over the world. Okay. So that's kind of this vast gap between have and have-nots. Now, let me flip topics for a second. And then Jeff, you wrote about this in the chat box. Let's talk about, right, the explosion of technology in 2 ways. One, exponential technology. So what does exponential technology mean? I want to get what that means. Exponential technology means that it's not a bow and arrow. It's not a B-52 bomber. We're talking about exponential technology distributed in relatively diffuse ways, which has the ability itself to destroy the planet. So exponential tech is exponential destruction. Right? Exponential tech, as a friend of mine likes to say, is exponential suck. Right? I mean, it's a disaster. Bows and arrows, B-52 bombers can't destroy the planet. Exponential tech can. Right? That's a reality that's never existed before on the face of the earth. But it's even more dramatic than that. There's an exponential explosion of nanotech, infotech, and biotech. Let's just look at what that means for a second. So take artificial intelligence. So I'll just look at it from 2 perspectives. And again, we're going to hold this briefly. We're at 7:12. So stay close. Let's hold on to our seats. Buckle up. Okay, here we go. So artificial intelligence, what does that mean, artificial intelligence? Driven by today what's called machine learning, which is an entirely new level, right, of artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence means that we can actually program a computer, right, to perform a vast array of human functions, from being a bodyguard to being a lawyer, right, to being even an accountant, right? We're getting to a place where AI could even be a psychologist, and we'll talk why in later sessions why that's true, right? But an enormous amount of human function, actually the overwhelming majority of human function, right, will be, according to the best anticipations, taken over by artificial intelligence within a relatively short period of time. Is that 20 years? Is it 15? Is it 25? Is it 30? Is it 40? Unclear, but it's a relatively short amount of time. And the result will be, and I want you to hold on to your seat, that the overwhelming majority of human beings will not have jobs. Okay, so get what that means in terms of human identity. You don't have a job. You're unnecessary, right, to the larger system, or at least so it seems, based on, right, the current understanding of reality. Now that's shocking. That's shocking. And if the issue of the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century, was workers being afraid of exploitation, that's not the issue now. The issue is irrelevance, right? That actually most people won't be exploited. Most people will be irrelevant. You're not needed. And you might think you're needed as a consumer. 40 years down the road, 30 years down the road, actually trading will happen between artificial intelligence entities, right? And you're actually not even needed as a consumer. So we've moved from exploitation to irrelevance. What does that mean? So that's one dimension of AI that's enormously important, right? And it kind of changes the essential structure of what it means to be a human being. But that's not yet, that's the first dimension of existential risk, right? Because when the overwhelming amount of human beings become irrelevant, so you got to then rely on goodwill between people. But what happens to that goodwill when the rubber hits the road? You've got to decide who's in and who's out, because there's an utter limitation of resource, right? And you don't need the workers. You begin to see where existential risk and catastrophic risk begin to play. But it's even deeper than that. Let's look for a second at the basic structure, right, of, right, the essential apparatus, right, of the world today, of the internet, right? What's the internet? So let's take a look at Google. Let's take a look at Facebook. Let's take a look at Amazon. Let's take a look at Oracle. Let's take a look at Verizon, right? Let's take a look at Samsung. And an enormous range of companies. The first leader was Google. Facebook picked up in their wake. What are they doing? What is actually the mission of Facebook? So they tell you, right, it's to connect people worldwide, right? That's a lie. That's not the mission of Facebook. It's just not true, right? Google says it's to organize the world's information. That's a lie, right? The entire structure and imperative of Google and Facebook is actually not that at all. What Google and Facebook and all of their imitators are doing is essentially based on the exhaust. Let's call it the exhaust. There's the engine and the exhaust of the engine. So the exhaust from the massive engagement with the Facebook platform by, let's say, 2 billion users, the massive engagement with Google creates an exhaust. And that exhaust is the extraction potential, which is actually the goal of both Google, Facebook, and this whole host of characters. And what does that mean? It means that every move you make on the web, how long your mouse hovers over a particular site, not just what sites you look at, how do you put a exclamation point or not an exclamation point when you write? Let's say you have the WhatsApp app, which has 19 billion users. You're not charged. Why aren't you charged? Because WhatsApp is gathering data about you. What's actually happening is that the entire apparatus of the web is a vacuum, right, to take your experience and then using AI-driven machine intelligence, translate your experience into data. And that data is a new script. And just like in the old world, that there was a priestly class, and they were the only people who had access, right, to the hidden script. Now we have some 10,000 data scientists, right, who are aligned with, hired by, right, vacuumed from reality. So none of those scientists are looking at dealing with issues of existential risk or catastrophic risk. None of them are looking at the greater good. They've been vacuumed from reality, right? Absorbed by the Googleplex, the Facebookplex. Their intention is to take all of your experience, translate it into data, and then based on that, develop predictive analysis about what you're going to do. And then not just sell that predictive analysis to advertisers in order to create targeted ads, but to actually influence your behavior in the real world directly. It's to influence two primary forms of behavior. And let's get this really clear. One is that of the voter, the other is that of the consumer, right? And democracy is based on a voter and a consumer. If you lose voter and you lose consumer, right, democracy disappears. And the entire imperative of AI is to generate a world in which we can remove the uncertainty of the advertiser, and we want to actually make available to those who own the data predictive certainty about your actions, whether that's how you're going to vote, because we're going to actually influence how you vote by actually acting in all sorts of nudges and cues, which are very sophisticated, right? Knowing you personally, because we've actually developed a personality profile on you particularly. That's exactly what's happening. That's actually stored within the AI machine intelligence world, and we can actually influence the way you're going to vote. And Barack Obama used nascent versions of this. The Trump campaign used nascent versions of this, right? But it's actually serious, right? As this is actually ramping up, as we're actually now gaining information from not just what you do over the skin, not just what you type in, not just how you access, how you appear, not just the Internet of Things that records through your digital assistant what you're talking about in the house, not just your, for example, thermostat, which is a smart thermostat, and your bed, which is a smart bed, all the smart apps, which are like Alexa, the digital assistant recording what's happening. All of that information is absorbed. A personality profile of you is created, and you're now subject to manipulation. Now, when you add to that biometric sensors, when it goes from over the skin to under the skin, which is exactly where it's going, and you might think, I don't need to participate, but we're getting very close to a world in which you can't get insurance. You can't get a job. You don't have health possibilities without becoming part of the system, whether that's in a democracy or an ostensible democracy, right? Or actually an authoritarian regime. You begin to see what's happening here? We're moving towards a world where democracies are relevant, the voters are relevant, the consumers are relevant. We're moving towards digital dictatorships with the data not owned by a public collective, not for the greater good, the data owned by an extremely narrow group of several dozen people who are driven by profit, power, and control, right? Now just you begin to get it. So you've got this elite, right? This case system, begin to think Hunger Games, right? Exponentialized. You begin to get a sense of this, right? So all of these things contribute to catastrophic risk, right? And, right, existential risk, right? When AI becomes so radically intelligent that actually our ability to control it actually disappears. So these are just a set, we've just talked about, it's now 7:21. We've talked about just a fragrance, right? A fragrance, right, of, right, catastrophic risk, existential risk. And it's no wonder that depression is the largest growing disease in the world, that obesity, right, is out of control, right? That opioids, right, or are pandemicking in their own way throughout the world, because actually, right, the sense of impending calamity, the sense of having lost control, the sense of it not being about me, it's about cyberborgs, right? It's about machine learning, right? It's about blockchain. How am I part of this? And there's this sense that it's changing so fundamentally, and it is. And actually, the ability to see that is to see around the corner, right? To be able to visualize that exponential change is not linear. Exponential means not 30 steps, right? It means that each step it doubles, and then it doubles again, and then it doubles again, then it doubles again, and then it doubles again. That's exponential change. That's the rate of change. And that rate of change is so frightening, right, that we actually experience correctly that and although we can't quite articulate it, that the phase shift we're beginning to go through And it's incremental. It doesn't happen all at once. It's day by day. You hear this and you hear that. Now we're used to a pandemic. We're used to wearing masks. We're used to lockdowns. We're dissociated from the fact that, let's say in the United States, right, tens of millions of people have lost their jobs and don't actually know how to pay for their food. But as long as we're not affected, right, until they come for us, right, that's the encroachment, the gradual encroachment of catastrophic, which will then climax in existential risk. Okay, we got a sense of it. Let's hold here for a second, okay? Now, we've got to be able to kind of grasp this, right, in order to be able to respond. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, we've got to be able to imagine it, but we're not imagining it, right, in the sense of falling into a collective depression, because depression, the etiology of depression is futility. It means you can't actually affect things. We can affect things. We actually have the capacity to step into the story. We have the capacity to step up to the table of history in a serious, compelling, and consequential way. Okay, so let's take step 2. Deep breath. Everybody, deep breath. Okay, good. So you got now a 60-second bathroom break. 60-second bathroom break. Right, we'll be back in 60 seconds. Don't go to your cell phone. Don't send a text. Don't get absorbed by the web. Don't get hijacked. Stay in. Try and hold this. Try and imagine this for a second. We're back in 60 seconds. Here we go. $55, $56, $57, $58, $59, $60. Okay, how many of you send a text? Let's take a look in the chat box. Who sent a text? Okay, you will be appropriately punished. Sharif and Gabriel will be administering those punishments. We'll discuss that later. Oh my God, you can administer self-punishment there, Ms. Anwar. Okay, self-flagellation, which can be good. Okay, yay. Oh my God. We ready? We ready? Good morning, Vietnam. Okay, Robin Williams. What happened to Robin Williams? Good morning, Vietnam. Was that a great movie? Here we go. Okay, you ready? Here we go. So let's take the next step. So we can impact, we can affect this. And again, we're taking our seat at the table here. We're taking our seat at the table of destiny. And I want to just, pull out for a second something that we wrote for, as Gabriel and Sharif were stepping in to be the board chairs of the center. We held 2 meetings in 2019 and 2020, right, at their home. Actually, the last meeting was right before the pandemic started, literally, right, a few days before. And we wrote an invitation and we wrote something like this. And I want to just read you a couple of lines. And then we're going to take this huge leap forward, right? And we've got now exactly 19 minutes left. We need every second of every minute. Okay, so stay with me, okay? And again, notice, right, we're both filled with trembling, but we're also filled with joy, right? The joy of responsibility, the joy of action, the joy of engagement. We stand poised, and I'm reading, we stand poised between a potential utopia of freedom, elegant order, and creative consciousness, and a dystopia of pain, suffering, and destruction, unlike the world has ever seen, which the human being may well not survive. That's a simple fact. To ignore this is to be either asleep, delusional, or lying. To respond to the challenge and invitation of this moment in time is the ethical and erotic imperative of this generation. When I say erotic, I mean in the sense of Plato's eros, right? The full engagement with life. And I'm reading this on behalf of the Center for Integral Wisdom, Gabriel, Sharif, myself, and the whole gang. This is the invitation, okay? Most people are barely aware of the challenges that will change the very structure of reality and selfhood as we know it in the next relatively short period of time. But for those of us who have the resources, the courage, and capacity to step out of the myopia of daily concern and grasp the big picture, it's the categorical imperative, the ultimate responsibility, and therefore the greatest joy of our lives. We're not moved, as we said earlier, we're not moved by fear, although radical concern is more than appropriate, but we're animated by what we called earlier, friends, an ecstatic urgency and dignity, which derive from the privilege, right, of taking our seat at the table of destiny and history. So you were invited tonight because you're such a person. That's a simple truth. You may not know it yet. You may not know what to do with that truth, but it's there and you can begin to feel it. It's hard to know. We understand how to pick up your head and see, right? To see the vast picture. It's confusing. There's such a glut of irrelevant information that it's hard to get any clarity about anything. Things seem murky and obscure, and you're busy, right? You're attending to your life. You're raising your kids. You're making your contribution to public culture. You're running a company. You're working a job. You may do volunteer work. You do some philanthropy. You have a pet project, but that will not do what needs to be done. Wow. Okay. So here's our invitation. Let's step in. What can we do? How do we step in? And it's the next 16 minutes that we got together for, okay? So next 16 minutes, okay? We ready? Here we go. I'm gonna throw a new idea on the table. Effective altruism. Effective altruism is a movement that was started by a bunch of people, many of them students of Parfet, who I mentioned earlier in Oxford. It has another name that it sometimes goes by called consequentialism. And consequentialism, or effective altruism, essentially asks a simple question. Let's say you've got $500, 500 pounds of funds to give to make the world better. And let's say you live, for example, in England. Where should you give it? Should you give it in Sussex? Should you give it in Manchester? Should you give it locally? Or is that a mistake? Are you being seduced by kind of feelings of self-narcissistic indulgence? I want to give it locally so I feel good, so I look good, right? But actually, if I gave that $500 to buy mosquito nets in Somalia, wow, right? I'd save 3 times more lives than I would if I gave those 500 pounds in Great Britain. So effective altruism means I want to actually evaluate. There's a moral imperative to evaluate what's effective altruism or consequentialism. And it's, where does my generosity, where does my gifting, right, have the most generous impact, right? That's effective altruism. Now, let's see if we can bring a couple things together here, okay? Let's apply effective altruism to Derek Parfit's question. All right, Derek Parfit's question is scenario 2 or scenario 3 worse? Well, clearly from the perspective of effective altruism, scenario 2 is you lose most of the population of the world, 7.5 billion. Scenario 3 is you lose the remaining, but you also lose the entire future. So from the perspective of effective altruism, clearly I've got to take responsibility for the future. It's the realization that we are the only voice for the future. The future generations, and see if you can kind of grasp this, the future generations have no voice other than us, right? And there's a covenant, right, between the generations, right? Every generation, we have a responsibility to respond as the overriding moral imperative of this moment in history, right, to existential risk for the sake of the present, number 1. Number 2, for the sake of the past, because all previous generations are engaged in an incremental process of transformation and evolution, and they're passing the baton to us. And there's an enormous amount of unfinished business in history, ethically, morally, aesthetically, philosophically, in terms of the good, the true, and the beautiful. So if we stop here, then all the sacrifices and all the commitments of the past disappear. That they're ineffective. Everyone get that? And 3, we have a responsibility to the future because we are the only voice for the future. So we're talking about 1 trillion years. We're talking about exponentially more than 7 billion people. From the perspective of effective altruism, right, actually engaging existential risk is exponentially more valuable than any other way you can commit your resource and time. That's a big deal. Okay, let's take it another step. Okay, so what should we do? Right, so how do we engage? Okay, now hold on to your seat. Let go of wisdotainment. Right, who cares? Right, do you like me? Don't like me? Don't care. Love you dearly. Let's be friends. Let's love each other madly. And that's not the point. This is not entertainment. This is not like a, let's have a nice, right? We had a nice evening. Oh, didn't we have a nice evening? Gabriel and Sharif, they invited us to such a nice evening. Really? We're talking about existential risk. We're talking about all future generations. And yes, it's a great evening and it's wildly exhilarating. And there's an enormous sense of community we're beginning to feel between each other because we feel, right, the destiny and the calling, right, of this moment. And there's nothing more beautiful. There's nothing more centrally enlivening, right, than the community of the committed who are responding to the call, who are answering the call. So that's us. That's who we are. Okay, so here we go. What do we do? What do we do? Now, here's where it gets like wildly important. And now again, we're at 7:33. We got 12 minutes. Okay, so my name's Leonardo da Vinci. Not actually, but let's say we're all Leonardo da Vinci together. I'm Leonardo da Vinci. I'm in the Renaissance. The Black Death has now swept Europe. Can you feel that? It swept Europe. 25 to 50% of the people have died. Da Vinci and Marcello Ficinio, right? The entire early gang of the Renaissance. They can't make it to every village and affect and impact, right, the tragic outcome, right? And you look at the descriptions of the deaths, right? It's actually beyond imagination. Parentheses, by the way, right? The Black Death was probably started by an act of bioterrorism, right? When actually the Moors actually threw over the walls, right, disease-infected bodies, right, at a particular battle, right? So bioterrorism, right, familiar in the age of pandemic, because actually, according to the best information we have, the pandemic was probably not started by a bat in the wet market in Wuhan, China, that got accidentally infected, right? Best information is, non-conspiracy theory, best information is that it was actually manufactured in a laboratory. The question is, was it deliberately, right, spread, or was it carelessly spread? We do know that the Chinese government stopped all flights from Wuhan within China, quite a while before they let the world know that that was happening. Complex scenario, bioterrorism. We've got the pandemic. We've got the Black Plague. Da Vinci is at the moment of the Black Plague. What does he do? What does Marcello Ficinio do? What does the Renaissance do? And our salon that's going to meet every month, and Gabriel and Christina made this gorgeous, right, aesthetic expression, right? If you remember your invitation, this is the Renaissance. Right? We're in the Renaissance. We're in this new moment. We're in this phase shift between worlds. So what's the only thing that Da Vinci can do? He can actually tell a new story, right? He can tell a new story about reality, a new story about what it means to be a human being, a new story about the relationship between the human being, right, and the infinite, right, and the divine, right? A new story about the scientific method, a new story about the emergence of the feminine, a new story about art, a new story about third-person perspective, a new story about depth, a new story about universal human rights, right? The movement from the tragedy and travesty of the pre-modern period that goes until the Renaissance, right? And the emergence of a new world called modernity, right, is mediated through the one effective interior technology. I'm calling this an interior technology, which is the telling of a new story. Stories change reality. Human beings don't think in numbers exclusively. Human beings don't even think in facts. Human beings think in terms of stories. We think in stories. Let's see if we can kind of grasp this for a second. What is a story? Well, Homo sapiens emerge from the rest of the animal kingdom about 70,000 years ago. What allows that to happen? Language. And what does language do? According to some anthropologists, language gives you a more effective way to hunt. Unlikely. Evolutionary psychology reduction. Yes, that's true, but it's not the core of language, right? More perceptive anthropologists understand something far more profound. Language allows you to articulate a shared story. And what a shared story means is that I'm not only related to the people that I physically am intimate with, I have a new way of generating intimacy. We're intimate because we're participating in a shared story, which means we can touch each other even if we've never met each other. So that's the ability to organize large groups of people, right, into a coherence that can actually be effective. That's what language does. It's the original telling of a story. Now, let's see if we can access this. The only technology that changes history in the source code level, right, is story. It's the telling of a new story, which of course integrates and plays with and is intertextured with new forms of trade and techno-economic bases. But at the root, what has to emerge is a new story. What Da Vinci and his friends do in the Renaissance was a time between worlds, between pre-modernity and modernity. It all changed. It was a time between stories. What they did is they told a new story. That was the story of modernity. And the accurate plot lines of that story, right, the accurate trajectories of that story birthed all of the dignities of modernity. The tragedies of that story birthed all of the disasters of modernity and set the stage for this moment of existential risk. And we're going to unpack that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so let's stay close. Let's stay close. So we are like Da Vinci in a time between worlds. We're in a time between stories. The old stories are not holding. Democracy. I love democracy. But let me ask you a question. Who voted on the internet? How many people on this call voted on the internet? Who voted on artificial intelligence? Right? Who voted on machine learning driving artificial intelligence? Who voted on the Googleplex? Right? Did you begin to understand? Right? Actually, the core forces that are animating reality, and today, right? Today, tomorrow, right? Elections in the United States, super important, right? Of incredible significance. But I have to tell you that the significance of the election pales before the fundamental structural changes that are happening at this phase shift in human history, right? Animated by climate, by rogue weapons, animated by the gap between the have and the have-nots, animated by nanotech, infotech, and biotech, animated by AI and machine intelligence. These changes are so dramatic that it actually makes elections pale. And as we saw before, the very structure of voter and consumer is being made all but irrelevant, and choice, right, is rapidly disappearing. And we're not even aware it's happening because the people acting against us, we don't even realize they're there, right? And so AI, machine intelligence, that destroyed, for example, Boris Kasparov, chess master, has now exponentially improved, right? And the new AI roundly defeated the AI that defeated Kasparov. And that new AI and machine intelligence is actually poised, right, to actually manipulate your choice, your vote, right? And we're getting closer and closer to direct manipulation of the vote in much, much wider terms, right? And your consumer choices. And imagine that you now have biometric sensors, under the skin sensors, that actually track every movie you watch, right? So do you really think that you have a chance, that your feelings can't be manipulated, that you're not going to actually get absorbed in an information ecology that's fundamentally broken? That's just one example. So actually, we're at this moment in time. We're actually at a time between worlds. The old structures don't hold in the way they did before, right? The old structures of governance, the old structures of identity, right? We're actually at a time between worlds. We're at a time between stories. And what we need to do is we need to tell a new story. And it's only the telling of a new story that has the capacity, right, to actually change the game, to change the trajectory of history. And we got to go one more step. Okay. Who's up for one more step? Can we go one more step together? Can we? Okay. One more step. One more step and we're done. Okay. And I promised we'd be done, right, in exactly 4 minutes. And I lied. It's going to be 7 minutes. Okay. Maybe. Okay. I think we're going to be done in 7 minutes, but stay close in the last 7 minutes. Right, this is where it happens. Okay. We got to stay super, super close together. We ready? Okay. Let's take a break. Break's over. Here we go. Let's see if we can follow this. So if I asked you, friends, right, and I'm so grateful on the behalf of evolution and on behalf of the future, and I'm so grateful that you're here, and Gabriel and Sharif and Christina and all of us are just madly grateful and madly excited and madly appreciative, right, that you're here. And before we end, I just want to say, before I do the last 4 minutes, just to Gabriel and Sharif, right, that you're stepping up and your participation and your leadership is everything, right? And I have full trust, right, in your capacity and our partnership, and that we're actually going to together take our seat at the table and actually make a difference beyond imagination, right? So here we go. Ready, everyone? So if I asked you as our last question, what is the generator function of existential risk, right? So it means if you get underneath everything, right? Underneath all of the techno-economic issues and all of the political issues and the particular dimensions of every one of the 10 major risks from, kind of methane gas on the tundras, which are exponentially more damaging, right, than carbon, and all the risks we mentioned and some that we didn't. But if we try to understand what's underneath, that's what we mean by a generator function, right? Root cause, what's the generator function of existential risk? And it's been the generator function of existential risk throughout history, right? When I say existential risk, I mean risk, and let me go slow. Every civilization has collapsed. There's no civilization that hasn't collapsed. So every civilization, though, was local. So every civilization faced a local existential risk. Does that make sense, everyone? It was a local existential risk. Rome was going to fall, right? Carthage was going to fall. Hannibal did what he could, right? In other words, every particular empire, every particular civilization falls. So it faces not an existential risk to existence, but to its own existence. Now, stay close. But we're now in a global civilization, right? Now, if every civilization has fallen, and it's fallen for a set of particular generator functions I'm about to unfold, none of which have we changed. Now we have a global civilization, the first global civilization. Clearly, the global civilization is going to fall. But when a global civilization falls, as a result of not bows and arrows or B-52 bombers, but exponential tech, right, then there's no future. So it's not just that civilization that fell, but the entire future fell. Every future civilization fell. Everyone get the grasp? You get the grasp what we're talking about? Okay. So what is the generator function for the fall of a civilization? And it's that same generator function that drives, right, catastrophic and existential risk today in our non-local but global civilization, which will this time, right, be exploded by exponential tech, which destroys the whole thing. So here we go, the last 3 minutes. And this is the most important, this is the essence of everything. This is what we're coming to. This is where kind of it, right? The ideas kind of come together and cohere, and you begin to be able to see it, okay? So the generator function of existential risk and catastrophic risk is twofold. Number one, rivalrous conflict, right? Human beings being driven by rivalrous conflict, rivalrous conflict, which is governed by a win-lose metrics, right? And the modern expression of that in modernity is the success story. Now, the success story is a built-in program that drives all of us, and it's win-lose. I succeed, you lose. Right? I'm in an agency. My agency fights your agency. Within the agency, there's 5 departments. The departments are, right, covertly aligned against each other. Only one person gets to win. It's actually win-lose, right? I'm applying, you're applying to college. Who's going to get in? Right? Countries against each other, organizations against each other, departments within government against each other, right? On staff, infighting between the staff, right? It's never a kind of omni-considerate perspective. I'm looking at the whole picture, right? Actually, the core identity of the modern human being is I'm a separate self. I'm in a competition. I need to demonstrate my value, right? I don't have intrinsic value. I've got to demonstrate that value. I demonstrate that value by earning commodified funds, which then show my value. And I earn those funds by competing with you for the part, for the role, for the person, for the husband, for the relationship, right? The entire system, all the way up and all the way down, is governed by an invisible structure. And that invisible structure is rivalrous conflict, right? Based on a win-lose metrics. And its modern expression is the success story of the separate self. That is the core structure of civilization, all the way up and all the way down, which then drives the extraction model to feed the consumption, right? To cover over the emptiness, and to drive the move, right, for the achievement and for status, right, which then drives the exponential growth curve, which has to fall off, right? You begin, it's all one, right? It's all one complex. So the first generator function of existential risk, right, which is an expression of a larger generator function. The larger generator function of existential risk is global intimacy disorder. And intimacy disorder all through history is what generates collapse of civilization, right? A fundamental alienation between the parts of a system, right? Which expresses itself as rivalrous conflict, either within the civilization or between the civilization and a competing civilization, where there's a win-lose metrics. The modern expression of it, right, which is this intimacy disorder in the very core and fabric of our communities and our personal identities in every interaction, every single relationship, right? So one person said to me a while ago, I'm going to vote for this person because I'm going to win-lose metrics and I need to put my family and my career first. Even though I don't believe in this person, I'm going to vote for them anyways because it serves my particular win-lose metrics. Really? Because that's when we make every decision, right? As the pandemic, Corona, right, threatened the world, right? Thousands of people around the world knew it was coming. There were virtually no whistleblowers at all anywhere because everyone made a win-lose metrics choice. I've got to succeed. I need my job. I need my job in a particular way. I'm not going to threaten my job, right? And so all of the thousands of people that knew what's happening, no one spoke up because everyone made the decision. The 10,000 best data scientists in the world who could actually put their attention on actually, right, addressing existential and catastrophic risk, virtually all have made win-lose metrics decisions. Universities don't have data scientists to teach today because they've all been absorbed by a particular economic package, right? At Intel, at Google, at Amazon, right? At Facebook, right? It's a particular win-lose metrics decision, right? That's how the decisions are made. It's a win-lose metrics, which is an expression of the larger intimacy disorder, which has now become a global intimacy disorder. That then, right, so the fundamental generator function is a global intimacy disorder. The intimacy disorder has now become global. Right? That's our contemporary situation, right? Because we have a global civilization. The first expression of the intimacy disorder, right? The first is rivalrous conflict, governed by win-lose metrics, modern expression, success story, right? But it's fabric. It's the fabric of the whole story. And just check your life. Right? Check your entire life, right? Do a simple personal inventory. You'll know that it's true. Number two, the second dimension, the second expression of the fundamental generator function or root cause is complicated systems, complicated, fragile systems, infrastructures, financial grids, grids of supply chain, which are vast, stretched across the world, in which all the parts don't have genuine connectivity. They don't have genuine empathos. They can't feel each other. There's no genuine allurement between the parts. There's alienation between the parts. So a vast system, right, which is complicated and fragile, right, which is different than complex and anti-fragile. Complex and anti-fragile, think Brazilian rainforest. Complex system, anti-fragile, regenerates, right, heals itself, balance, right, structure, telos, right? You think complicated system, think about what caused, think about the vast array of undecipherable financial instruments moved around the world in 2008 that caused the global meltdown in 2008. That's a complicated system that breaks down, okay? You begin to see it? So those two factors, right, those two expressions, complicated versus complex systems, number one. Number two, rivalrous conflict expressed or governed by win-lose metrics, modern expression, success story. Those two factors are the root cause of all existential risk because that's the only story we have in modernity. So here we go. We finished now literally in 2 minutes. Modernity's great move, it stepped out of pre-modernity. It told a new story about the individual, about human creativity, about the scientific method. And to the precise extent that we got that storyline accurate, right? We created the dignities, the beauties of modernity. But to the precise extent that that storyline was flawed, and we're going to talk about these last 10 minutes in much more depth in our next conversation, to the precise extent that it was flawed, that we generated a hyper individual, right? Who was a separate self, who experienced him or herself as divorced from the larger context of value, from the larger context of meaning, from the larger context of intimate communion, right? With nature and other, right? To that precise extent that that separate self, right? Then is driven by win-lose metrics, rivalrous conflict, right? We create the breakdown that then generates complicated systems, which are a result of, right, the exponential growth curve, right? You begin to get that, you begin to get a sense of how it works. So what do we need to do? Okay, if you lost some of the details there, don't worry. Anyone, friends of Gabriella, friends of Sharif, friends of mine, if you lost a few details in those few minutes, we did it quickly. We'll do it gently and slowly. Believe me, you can hold this. You're going to understand this better than anyone in the world. But what's the response? Now our last 30 seconds. So this is a bad story. It's a narrative that doesn't work. We live in inescapable frameworks. We live within a story, and the story generates everything we do. So when we have a narrow win-lose metric success story generating our every action, then we generate collapse, a civilizational collapse across the board. And actually, all of David Attenborough's suggestions in his beautiful movie, Life on This Planet, are irrelevant because, with all due respect to you, David, and you're awesome and you're beautiful, he doesn't address the generator functions. He doesn't address root causes. And the root cause is the story itself that is the inescapable framework, right? That's actually animating reality. But here's the great news. And with this, we finish. That means there's a way forward. And what's the way forward, friends? We tell a new story. Not a fanciful story, not a made-up story. We tell a new story of the universe, a new universe story, based on the best information available on the planet today. We tell a new story of what it means to be a human being, a new narrative of identity, a new narrative of desire, a new narrative of power, a new narrative of community. And those new narratives, right, which become the new story, become part of the fabric of a global ethos for a global civilization. We face global problems which are unimaginable. We can only respond to global problems through global coherence. If there's not global coherence, we have no chance. Did you notice there was no big meeting in January of 2020, right? When everybody knew the pandemic, COVID-19 was coming. Where were all the world leaders? Where was the big meeting that happened? Do you remember that meeting? Where everyone got together, we pooled our resources, we coordinated functions, we created global coherence. Everybody knew it was coming. No one shared information. We're talking about a virus that obviously crosses boundaries, that doesn't respect national sovereignty. And yet we weren't able to create global coherence, because you can only create global coherence when there's a shared story. It's a shared story that generates the intimacy, right, of a shared global community that can then generate global coherence that can then respond to global threat. So what we're going to do here together, and Miami is now Florence. And it's not that it's just Miami, but this is the center, just like it wasn't just Florence. You know, we've all made a decision together. And we've said, you know what? We thought it was Manhattan. No, it's not. It's not quite Tokyo. And Tokyo is important. Manhattan's important. But actually, right, we're actually inviting the Renaissance from a place where people thought it was least likely. That's always the case. We're going to actually together, right, together, we're inviting each other. We're going to take our seat at the table of history. And Miami becomes the new Florence. In this time between worlds, in this time between stories. And you might say, why me? Why not you? Why should it be someone else? Right? What an ecstatic privilege, right, to take our seat at the table. I know it's daunting. I know it's a lot. I know we did a lot in an hour and 8 minutes or 9 minutes. I madly want to honor and appreciate, right, your presence and your holding space. And I know there's some things you didn't catch, and there's questions unanswered, and there's a lot more to talk about. But this is at least the context of the conversation. We can begin to have the conversation. What are we going to do? We're going to articulate a new story based on the best new information across all platforms, physics and molecular biology, and the great traditions and interiors and exteriors and Hebrew traditions and Fey traditions, right? And the best of the Stoics and Marcus Aurelius, right? The whole story. We're going to bring it together in a new whole, a new story, greater than the sum of the parts, that becomes seamlessly available across reality. You can tell it to 70 beautiful truck drivers in Montana. You can tell it in Tokyo. You can tell it in Beijing, right? You can tell it across Europe. You can tell it in the Philippines, right? It's the shared story, because we've got to understand that which unites us is so much greater than that which divides us, right? Our shared humanity articulated, not as a slogan, not as a declaration, with a new shared universe story, a new narrative of identity, a narrative of power, right? A narrative of community, a narrative of intimacy. Because we live in an intimate universe, and the intimate universe lives in us, and we are evolution in person. And evolution itself, the future itself, awaits us. So thank you, everyone. Thank you. Just madly appreciative and mad honor. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Marc, thank you so much. What a delightful invitation to this global table of a feast.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up the floor for questions. I'm sure there are many. That was a lot of information. My God, that was like,
Oh my gosh.
Crazy thought-provoking. So let's continue this conversation every month, the first Monday of every month, indefinitely, until we've created the utopia that we dream of. And any questions, please either type them in the chat box or unmute yourselves and be heard. God damn it.
Fan damn it, right? God damn it is a good way to end. And Gabrielle, let's send to everyone when we send the recording, let's send the chat thread to everyone as well. Oh my God, thank you so much.